This 1898 photo looks normal. Four children, silent, still, but one small detail shocked experts, something that should not exist in a photograph this old. Imagine a photograph more than 100 years old. At first glance, it looks ordinary, four children, silent, sitting still. But when experts took a closer look, they realized something was hidden in the image, something that should not have existed at that time. A small detail that still makes people uneasy today. This story begins with a photograph from 1898, and the secret trapped inside it has never truly gone silent. The ledger was opened under weak morning light, the kind that slips through high windows and settles on dust without disturbing it, and for a moment the room held its breath. Its spine was cracked, its pages swollen by smoke and time, the ink brown like dried blood. Inside, between property transfers and funeral expenses written in a careful 19th century hand, lay a photograph pressed flat as if someone had wanted it to stay hidden and preserved at the same time. Four children sat on a narrow wooden bench. Their boots were polished, their coats buttoned to the throat. Their hands rested in their laps with the practiced stillness of children taught early that movement invites correction. In the corner of the image, barely legible, a date lingered like an afterthought. 1898. There were no names, no studio stamp, no town listed beneath their feet, just faces. Faces too composed, too quiet, carrying an awareness that did not belong to children. And that's when they noticed something disturbing. The photograph emerged during the restoration of a provincial estate that had burned decades earlier and never been rebuilt, a mansion once owned by a modest industrialist whose fortune had grown without headlines or celebration. The house had stood empty for years, its roof sagging inward, its corridors collapsed like lungs that had forgotten how to draw breath. Rain had entered freely. Birds nested where portraits once hung. When archivists sifted through what remained, they expected contracts, letters, perhaps a deed or two. They did not expect a photograph spared by fire, untouched by moisture, preserved as though the destruction around it had been instructed to stop short. At first, the image seemed unremarkable. Children were photographed constantly at the end of the century, stiffly posed, unsmiling by necessity rather than sadness, held still by long exposures and adult hands just outside the frame. Yet something in this image delayed the eye, not fear, not horror, but a pause that refused to resolve. The children were dressed alike, not in finery but in uniform practicality, their clothes clean yet impersonal, their collars sharp with recent starch. Their gazes did not meet the camera. They did not look toward the lens, nor down at the floor. Their eyes passed the photographer entirely, fixed on something beyond the frame, as if listening for a sound that had not yet arrived. The room where the image was first examined grew quiet in a way that had nothing to do with reverence. Conversation slowed. A hand hovered longer than necessary over the table. The photograph seemed to resist completion, like a thought interrupted before it could settle. When it was logged into the archive, assigned a number and wrapped in protective paper, a junior conservator paused and asked for it to be enlarged. She could not explain why. She said later that the image felt unfinished, like a sentence without punctuation, like a door left ajar without reason. The request was granted without discussion. Enlargements were routine. Old photographs often surrendered hidden details when magnified, a maker's mark, a tear, a date. No one expected more than that. The image was scanned, processed, and slowly brought into focus, its grain resolving into clarity. As the faces grew larger, the stillness deepened. The children's expressions did not soften. They hardened not into fear but into endurance. Their mouths were closed in a way that suggested practice. Their shoulders were squared, not with pride but with instruction. And then the details began to surface, not abruptly, but with the quiet persistence of something long buried and finally exposed to air. The bench beneath them showed wear inconsistent with a studio prop, its edges rounded by years of use. The backdrop was not cloth, but plaster, uneven and scarred, with faint markings that did not belong to decoration. The light did not fall evenly, as it would in a photographer's room, but filtered from one side, thin and restrained, as if entering through a single high window. The longer the image was studied, the more it refused to remain a simple portrait. The house from which it came had once been admired locally, not for beauty, but for order. It employed many. It donated quietly to churches and civic causes. It stood apart from the town, large enough to be noticed, distant enough to remain unexamined. The industrialist who owned it kept few letters and fewer friends. His ledgers were precise. His reputation was clean. When the fire consumed the upper floors years later, it was described as unfortunate but unsurprising. Empty houses burn easily. No one had searched the ruins closely at the time. There was no reason to. Now, as the photograph yielded its silence to modern light, that absence began to feel intentional. The children in the image could not be placed in census records. Their clothing did not match local fashions for families of means, nor did it reflect the poverty common to the region's laborers. They existed in a narrow space between categories, dressed well enough to be maintained, plainly enough to be unremarkable. The date 1898 fell during a period when institutions quietly expanded under the language of care and improvement. Children without guardians were gathered, housed, taught discipline, and put to use where needed. Records were kept, not all were shared. The photograph, now enlarged beyond its original intention, seemed less like a memory and more like a record. Not a celebration, but a confirmation. The longer the experts sat with it, the more the room filled with an unspoken understanding that the image had not been taken for the children's sake at all. It had been taken to mark something, to fix it in place. Outside the archive, the world continued with its ordinary sounds. Inside, the photograph held its ground. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It waited. The children's eyes, caught mid-listen, seemed to follow the viewer no matter where they stood, not in demand, but in expectation. The estate that had once contained them no longer stood, but its walls had remembered enough to pass something forward. The enlargement revealed shadows where there should have been none, lines too straight to be cracks, shapes too deliberate to be coincidence. Each detail emerged slowly, as if the photograph were reluctant to give itself away all at once. The silence around the table grew heavier, not because of what had been found, but because of what was beginning to be suspected. This image had survived fire, abandonment, and time for a reason that was only now becoming visible. The children had been made to sit, to hold still, to look past the present moment into something they understood better than the adults who surrounded them. And as the final resolution sharpened, as the grains settled into clarity, the sense grew that the photograph had not been waiting for technology at all. It had been waiting for witnesses willing to stay quiet long enough to hear what it had carried for more than a century. They came from the margins where ink rarely lingered and memory thinned quickly, children whose beginnings were spoken softly or not at all, orphans folded into records with provisional names, indentured wards signed over with trembling hands, sons and daughters of laborers whose days were measured by shifts and whose nights ended too early. In the 1890s, the language of improvement traveled faster than mercy, and institutions rose with clean facades and charitable seals, collecting children the way factories collected coal, necessary to keep systems warm, replaceable when burned through, unseen once consumed. These places promised order and instruction, bread and prayer, a future shaped by discipline, yet their doors closed with a sound that settled differently in the bones. Inside, life followed a careful rhythm, bells at dawn, meals counted and measured, lessons taught by rote, silence enforced not with cruelty alone but with routine, because routine teaches faster than fear. The children learned where to stand and when to sit, how to keep their hands still and their eyes forward, how to swallow questions before they reached the mouth. Records from the region spoke in polite phrases, a private educational home funded by industrial donations, a board of respectable men whose names appeared often and meant safety by association, weekly sermons delivered with measured gravity, locked doors described as safeguards, inspectors who arrived unannounced and left too soon, their visits recorded in neat lines that suggested thoroughness without substance. Invoices told a different story if one lingered long enough to notice the gaps, linen ordered for fewer beds than residents listed, medicine billed in quantities that did not align with the seasons, repairs logged to rooms that were not shown. As experts traced the photograph back through these documents, they found a pattern not of overt wrongdoing but of absence, birth certificates missing where there should have been entries, death notices filed without causes, census counts that swelled and shrank without explanation. Children arrived with dates and initials and were absorbed into the daily machinery of the place, and later fewer were counted, the subtraction carried out quietly, without alarm, without questions rising high enough to disturb the surface of things. There were no scandals because scandal requires attention, no trials because trials require voices, and voices learn quickly when silence keeps them alive. The photograph began to change under this weight of context, its edges less sentimental, its stillness more deliberate, less a keepsake than a record pressed into time. The identical clothing no longer suggested thrift or pride but institution, garments issued and retrieved, mended and reissued, belonging to the place rather than the child. The posture was no longer stiff from the demands of early cameras, but trained by repetition, bodies aligned to expectation, shoulders squared not to stand tall but to disappear into uniformity. When the background was digitally brightened, the wall behind them surrendered its faint markings, chalk lines rubbed thin by time, heights measured and remeasured, dates noted in shorthand, initials scratched with quick certainty, the quiet arithmetic of management rendered visible at last. None of this pointed to a single villain, no singular act that could be isolated and condemned, and that was the deeper injustice, a system built not to harm openly, but to forget efficiently, to distribute responsibility so thinly that it vanished. Adults spoke softly around these places because softness soothed conscience, because to speak loudly would require listening for answers. Towns prospered, wages circulated, shops opened and closed, and the home remained a fixture on the edge of respectability, a solution to a problem most preferred not to name. Churches rang bells on schedule, sermons praised order and patience, and the children learned the value of stillness, how silence could buy them another meal, another night, another chance to wake. The photograph captured them at the intersection of that learning, eyes set beyond the present moment, listening not for rescue but for instruction, for the next rule to follow. By the time the home closed, its doors shuttered not by scandal but by convenience, its directors had died respected deaths, their names etched into plaques and programs, remembered for generosity and steadiness, their legacies folded into civic pride. The children, if they survived, left no such marks, their names lost to margins and omissions, their stories dissolved into the background noise of progress. Only the photograph remained, patient in its concealment, a small rectangle of proof waiting for a moment when patience would be repaid. It asked nothing loudly, offered no accusation, but it endured, and endurance is its own testimony. As experts sat with the image and the ledgers and the thin air between them, the silence began to feel less like absence and more like inheritance, passed down carefully, protected by habit and politeness, guarded by the belief that what is not named cannot demand reckoning. The children in the photograph had learned that lesson early, their stillness a language shaped by necessity, and now, more than a century later, that same stillness pressed back against the present, asking whether it would be met with the same retreat or finally, at last, with the courage to listen. When the enlargement reached its final resolution, the room changed in a way that was difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. The hum of equipment seemed louder, then abruptly distant, as if sound itself had stepped back. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the image had begun to say it first. What emerged was not something newly added by technology, but something that had always been there, waiting for the distance between then and now to close enough for denial to fail. On the wrists of the two youngest children, pale shadows took shape, faint impressions pressed into skin that had already healed by the time the shutter closed. They were not dramatic. They did not shout. They followed a pattern too consistent to dismiss, a symmetry learned only through repetition. Marks left by restraint, not in a moment of rage, but as part of routine. The kind of marks that disappear quickly and are therefore favored by those who wish to leave no record. The children's faces did not reflect pain. They reflected familiarity with it, an understanding that certain things were expected and therefore endured. As the image sharpened further, the collar of the third child yielded another quiet truth. A small stitched symbol, barely visible in the original print, now stood clear. It was not decorative. It was not a family mark. It was an internal sign used by the institution to identify repeat disciplinary cases, a way to signal history without writing it down, to communicate across shifts and supervisors without inviting questions. It was a language spoken only by those inside the system, efficient and discreet. Behind the bench, the wall began to speak as well. Faint etchings surfaced, numbers scratched lightly into plaster, as if meant to be temporary, erasable. When matched against the parish ledger, those numbers aligned with burial entries recorded nearby during the same season. No names, just counts. The realization did not arrive as a shock, but as a slow settling, the way dust falls when a long closed book is finally opened. The final detail required a different kind of light. Infrared processing brought forward what the glass plate had captured unintentionally, a reflection hovering at the edge of the frame. An adult figure stood just beyond the children's line of sight, not holding the camera shutter as expected, but a ledger, open and angled toward the light. The posture was not hurried. The stance was calm, watching. The presence did not feel intrusive because it had always been there, just outside the field of view, shaping what was seen and what was recorded. Cross-referencing dates confirmed what the image suggested without drama. The photograph had been taken during the same week 4 unregistered child deaths were entered into local records as seasonal illness, a phrase broad enough to cover anything and therefore accountable for nothing. There were no corresponding birth records, no transfer notes, no family claims. The image, once thought a portrait, revealed itself as something colder, an inventory, proof of possession before disappearance. The children were not being remembered, they were being counted. What unsettled the experts was not only the evidence itself, but the manner in which it had been preserved. There was no sense of urgency in the photograph, no attempt to obscure or hide. Everything about it suggested procedure, a step completed because steps were always completed. No rage, no panic, just order. The children had been photographed the way one photographs furniture before relocation, to establish condition, to confirm quantity, to protect those who kept the records rather than those who appeared in them. The room held this understanding without movement. Papers lay where they had been placed. Screens glowed softly. Outside, the day continued as it always had. Inside, time folded back on itself, and the calm efficiency of the past pressed against the present with quiet force. A letter surfaced days later, folded thin by age and handled often enough to smooth its creases. It had been written decades after the photograph by a former groundskeeper whose name appeared nowhere else of note. His handwriting was careful, as if he had learned to make each word small. The letter contained little narrative, no confession in the usual sense, just observations, a description of routines, the weight of keys, the sound of bells. Near the end, a single line stood apart from the rest, written with heavier pressure, as though the pen had paused and then committed. They said the picture was for records. I think it was for conscience. The sentence did not explain itself. It did not need to. It carried the recognition of someone who had watched the process from the margins, who had understood even then that records can be used to protect memory or to erase it, and that conscience sometimes demands proof long before it finds the courage to speak. The revelation did not accuse loudly. It did not call for names to be dragged forward or statues to be torn down. It stood in the quiet authority of alignment, image matching ledger, marks matching numbers, dates matching absences. It asked only to be acknowledged. The experts who sat with it felt the particular weight of that request, the knowledge that to acknowledge is to accept responsibility not just for what is found, but for what follows. The photograph had waited more than a century for this moment, not because it required technology, but because it required attention sustained beyond curiosity. It required witnesses willing to remain with discomfort long enough for meaning to settle. The children in the image had done their part. They had held still. They had endured. They had left behind enough to be recognized when recognition finally arrived. The room, once filled with the quiet of denial, now held a different silence, one shaped by understanding. It lingered after the screens dimmed and the documents were filed, after the equipment was shut down and the lights lowered. It followed those who left, settling into their thoughts, asking a question that did not need to be answered aloud. How many other images waited like this, patient and precise, carrying their truth forward through fire and neglect, trusting that someone someday would look closely enough to listen. The estate was never rebuilt, and in that refusal to reconstruct there was a decision more deliberate than any stone could have carried. After the findings were published, after the photograph and the ledgers and the alignments of dates had entered public record, the land was surveyed and set aside, not as a place of honor, not as a destination for pride, but as a warning written into soil and air. Grass grew where walls once stood. Foundations were left exposed, their outlines filling slowly with rain and leaves. No statues rose to soften the truth. No names were restored to claim sympathy or forgiveness. Only a modest plaque was placed near the old drive, its metal dulled intentionally, bearing the date 1898 and beneath it 4 blank spaces, unfilled and unfillable. Visitors paused there longer than expected, reading nothing where names should have been, understanding without explanation that absence was the point. Locals said the place felt quieter afterward, not peaceful in the way gardens are peaceful, but settled, as if something that had paced restlessly for decades had finally found a place to lie down. Wind moved differently through the trees. Birds returned. Even the ground seemed less tense underfoot. The parish did not announce ceremonies or organize gatherings. Instead, a single bell toll was added to the calendar, rung once each year on an unnamed day in autumn. No sermon followed it. No notice appeared in the bulletin. The bell rang, sound traveling outward across fields and rooftops, and then it stopped. Those who heard it understood without being told that it was not for the living. The photograph itself was moved into controlled care, its original glass plate returned to darkness where light could no longer pull at it, where it could rest without being asked to prove itself again. In the archive, climate steady and dust held at bay, it lay among other artifacts that had survived long enough to be needed. Visitors came, but they rarely stayed long. The image resisted lingering. Some said the children's expressions seemed different now, not because the photograph had changed, but because the context had. They no longer appeared fearful or accusing. They appeared finished, as if the act of being seen, truly seen, had completed something that had been left open for too long. History did not punish the guilty. Time rarely does. The men whose names filled the ledgers had died long before, their reputations intact, their memorials undisturbed. There were no trials to reopen, no sentences to revise. What history did instead was quieter and therefore harder to dismiss. It refused to forget. It allowed the image to remain, the silence to speak, the empty spaces to insist on attention. The refusal echoed outward, changing how the land was held, how the bell was rung, how the archive was visited. It shaped memory without spectacle. In that refusal lay the final truth of the image, that power always leaves traces even when it believes itself invisible, that silence is never empty but filled with what it has been asked to contain, and that some names, lost to paper and ash and polite omission, only find peace when the truth is finally told, not loudly, not triumphantly, but steadily, until it can no longer be set aside.